The silence came first. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of cold so total it swallowed sound whole. Geralt of Rivia had crossed thresholds before. He'd walked out of ordinary forests into elven ruins where time bent sideways, stepped through wild hunt frost into nightmares that predated the continent's youngest gods. He knew what it felt like when the world changed under his boots. This was worse. This felt like stepping into a wound the world hadn't finished making. He came to on his back in snow that reached past his elbows, staring up at a sky bruised the color of a fresh corpse. Gray-green, starless, wrong. His medallion, the wolf's head sigil that had hummed warnings his whole professional life, vibrated against his sternum with a low, continuous dread that never spiked, never settled. It simply warned, the way a man might grind his teeth in his sleep. Constant, exhausted, afraid. He sat up. Ice cracked from his cloak in sheets. Around him stretched a forest of white trees he didn't recognize, their bark pale as bone, their leaves, where they had leaves at all, the deep arterial red of a fresh kill. Weirwoods, though he had no name for them yet. He only knew that when he looked too long at the carved faces bleeding sap down their trunks, something looked back. The portal that had taken him, if it could even be called that, this stuttering wound of ice and old elven magic he'd stumbled into mid-contract, chasing what he'd assumed was a wraith haunting a border keep, had spat him out somewhere his signs didn't sit right in his hand. He raised 2 fingers instinctively, murmured the shape of Igni under his breath, and felt the fire sign gutter like a candle in a gale before it even properly formed. Wrong. Everything here was subtly, fundamentally wrong, like a chord played 1/2 step flat. He got his feet under him. 20 years of contracts had taught him one law above all others. Figure out what kind of world you're standing in before you decide whether you're going to survive it. The world answered him first. It came shambling out of the tree line 40 yards off. A man, or what had been one, ragged furs still clinging to a frame, gone the color of spoiled milk. Its throat opened in a black wound that didn't bleed, that hadn't bled in what looked like days. Its eyes were the pale, drowned blue of a winter lake at dusk. It didn't stumble like the fevered undead Geralt had put down 100 times on the continent. The necrophages, the drowners, the rot-slow ghouls. It moved with purpose. It moved like something was steering it. Geralt's silver sword was in his hand before conscious thought caught up. Old instinct, older than fear. He'd learn later that steel did nothing to these things, that the ones who called them whites required fire, or a very specific kind of black glass to truly die. But in that first heartbeat, all he knew was undead, hostile, close, and his blade was already singing free of its sheath. The white came at him with a strength that belonged to nothing living. Geralt sidestepped, let the reaching hands claw empty air, and drove the silver blade through the base of its skull with the economical brutality of a man who had killed 1,000 things that wanted to wear his skin. The white didn't fall so much as stop. Mid-motion, all at once, like a puppet with its strings cut. He stood over it a long moment, breath fogging in air cold enough to hurt his teeth, and understood 2 things with the flat certainty of a witcher's training. Whatever this thing had been, it hadn't wanted to kill him for coin, or hunger, or hatred. It had wanted to kill him because something else had wanted it to. And second, the silver hadn't worked the way it should have. The wound had closed too clean. Something in this world's dead didn't respect the old rules. He was still crouched beside the unmoving thing when the patrol found him. 5 men in black, ranged in a loose crescent with bows half drawn and swords out, stepping from the weirwood shadows with the particular wariness of soldiers who had already buried friends this season. Their leader was young, younger than his ragged authority suggested, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat despite the killing cold, and eyes that measured Geralt the way a man measures a debt he isn't sure he can pay. "Don't move," the young man said. Not a threat, a plea dressed as an order. Geralt didn't move. He'd learned that lesson on the continent too. Men afraid of what you are will kill you faster than men who hate what you've done. He let the silver sword hang loose at his side, angled it downward, showed his open palm. "I killed it before it killed me," Geralt said, nodding at the unmoving white. Seemed the polite thing to do. The black-cloaked men exchanged glances that carried whole unspoken conversations. Men who'd learned to communicate in the shorthand of shared horror. The young leader's gaze dropped to the corpse, to the clean wound at the base of its skull, to the fact that it hadn't gotten back up. "That's not how you kill them," he said slowly. "Not with steel. It's not steel." Geralt turned the blade so torchlight. Someone had a torch, sputtering and small against the vast wrongness of the sky, caught the silver's particular gleam. "Never had cause to learn your rules. Didn't know I needed to. Where are you from?" A different voice, older, harder, a scarred man at the leader's shoulder who hadn't lowered his bow. "No man walks out of the haunted forest in this cold wearing that much steel, and not freezing to death." Geralt considered how much truth a man like this would accept before deciding it didn't matter enough to lie. "Somewhere, a long way from here. Long way from anywhere, from the look of things." "He's mad," the scarred man said. "Or worse. He killed a white clean," the young leader said, and something in his voice, exhaustion so deep it had become a kind of stubborn hope, made the others go quiet. "We've lost 6 men to those things since the new moon. He killed one without fire, without dragonglass, and it's staying dead." He looked back at Geralt, and Geralt recognized the look, because he'd worn it himself 1,000 times, standing over the body of something the villagers swore couldn't be killed. It was the look of a man recalculating what was possible. "John," said the scarred man, warning in his voice, "the Lord Commander won't like a stranger brought through the gate without— The Lord Commander will like 6 more dead men even less." John? The name settled into Geralt's memory like a stone into deep water. One more unfamiliar fact in a world made entirely of them. Sheathed his sword, though his eyes never fully left Geralt's blade. "You'll come with us. Castle Black isn't far. You'll answer for what you are, and how you came to be standing in the haunted forest killing wights with silver steel, no smith south of here ever forged." Geralt weighed the offer the way he weighed every offer, for the shape of the trap inside it, and found, for once, none waiting, only cold and duty, and men too tired to lie to him. It was, in its own bleak way, almost a comfort. He'd operated in worse company for less honest reasons. "Lead on," he said, and sheathed the silver sword. "But I'll want answers of my own, starting with what in every god's name I just killed." John's mouth made a shape that wasn't quite a smile. "That," he said, turning north, back toward a horizon Geralt couldn't yet see, "is going to take longer than the walk back." Above them, unseen, unheard, something vast and patient turned its attention southward, the first stirring of an awareness that would not forget the man who had killed one of its own and made it look easy. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. The walk to Castle Black took the better part of 2 days, and in that time Geralt learned more about the nature of this world's cold than he had learned about any climate in 20 years of contract work across the continent. It wasn't simply temperature. It had a texture, a patience, a way of pressing against the mind as much as the flesh. His medallion never stopped its low thrum of warning the entire journey, as though the land itself qualified as a threat. The men of the Night's Watch didn't speak much. What conversation passed between them was clipped, economical, the kind of talk that comes from people who've learned that words cost something in a place like this. John, Geralt gathered his family name was Snow, and gathered too, from the careful way the others said it, that the name carried some weight he didn't yet understand, walked point, setting a pace that assumed endurance rather than comfort. It was the scarred man, who introduced himself grudgingly as Ed, who finally broke the silence on the second morning. "You've killed things like that before," Ed said. "Not a question. Different things, similar problem." Geralt kept his eyes on the tree line. Old habit, the constant sweep for movement, that had kept him breathing through worse forests than this one. "The dead that don't stay dead aren't unique to your particular corner of misery. I've put down drowners, ghouls, things that wear a man's face after he's finished needing it. Never one that walked with that kind of purpose, though. Yours move like something's holding the reins." "Something is," John said, without turning. "We don't know what he looks like, only what he leaves behind. He, the one who raises them, John's shoulders were rigid beneath his black cloak, the posture of a man who had said these words before, and watched them not be believed. The Night's Watch has known of him for 1,000 years. In songs, children stopped singing because their parents stopped believing them. We know better now. Better and worse. Geralt filed that away with the flat professional interest of a man cataloging a job's true scope before naming a price. Except there was no price here, he reminded himself. No coin, no contract, no employer waiting with a purse and a problem he could solve and walk away from. Just an army of men in black who expected him to care about a war that wasn't his, in a world that wasn't his, against an enemy whose name they wouldn't even speak plainly. He didn't like the shape that thought was taking. He'd spent half his life building walls around the parts of himself that wanted to get involved, that wanted to matter to people, beyond the closing of a contract. Destiny had cost him enough already. He wasn't inclined to volunteer for more of it in a world he didn't recognize, fighting a war he hadn't chosen, for people who owed him nothing and he owed less. Castle Black rose out of the white like a wound in the landscape, black stone against white snow, and behind it, filling half the sky, the wall itself. Geralt had seen fortifications before. He'd stood atop the walls of Kaer Morhen in winter, watched siege engines break against Novigrad's ramparts, walked the ancient dwarven defenses beneath Mahakam. Nothing had prepared him for 700 feet of ice rising into cloud, ancient and silent, and radiating a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. That, Ed said, following his gaze, is the only thing standing between what's coming and everyone south of here. How long has it held? 8,000 years, they say. John's voice was quiet. It's never been tested like this, not since the long night the songs half remember. They brought him through the gate under close watch, bows still half raised, hands still near sword hilts, the wariness of men who had learned that hospitality in this season could get you killed. Geralt didn't take offense. He'd walked into enough villages himself to know that fear, dressed as caution, kept people alive longer than trust did. The Lord Commander received him in a hall, lit by guttering torches, and Geralt understood within moments why every man in this castle deferred to him. Not fear, precisely, but the gravity of someone who had outlived every easy answer and kept walking anyway. Jeor Mormont was old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had once been formidable and had simply refused to stop being useful. A raven perched on his shoulder that regarded Geralt with an unsettling, deliberate intelligence. "Snow tells me you killed a white with a silver blade," Mormont said, without preamble. "No fire, no dragonglass, just steel, and it stayed down." "Silver," Geralt corrected. "There's a difference, where I come from." "And where is that, precisely?" Geralt considered his answer the way he considered every lie and every truth, for maximum utility, minimum complication. "Somewhere far enough that your maps won't have it. I came through something I don't fully understand myself. A tear in the world might be the kindest way to put it. One moment I was hunting a different kind of monster. The next, I was standing in your haunted forest with a corpse that wouldn't stop reaching for my throat." The raven made a low, rasping sound. Mormont's eyes didn't leave Geralt's face. "Sorcery. Something like it. I don't practice it, for what it's worth. I only got caught in someone else's. And your blade. Silver, you said. Not Valyrian steel, not dragonglass. The two things in this world that reliably end them." Mormont gestured, and a steward brought Geralt's sword forward on an outstretched cloth, having confiscated it at the gate with the wary formality of men handling something they didn't understand. Yet it worked. "Silver's death to a great many things that shouldn't exist by natural law," Geralt said. "Monsters that predate men, curses given shape, the restless dead. Where I'm from, it's not myth, it's a trade. I've made my living, killing things that frighten ordinary men into paralysis." He met the old man's stare without flinching, because flinching had never once bought him anything worth having. "Sounds like you've got no shortage of work for a man in my line." Something shifted behind Mormont's eyes. Not quite trust, but the specific, weary calculation of a commander who had run out of the luxury of disbelief. "We've lost 12 rangers beyond the wall this past moon. Half came back as what killed the other half." He set down the raven, which hopped along the table's edge, muttering something that sounded almost like a word. "I don't believe in miracles, Witcher. Is that what you called yourself?" "Witcher. I don't believe in miracles. But I've learned to recognize a tool when the gods, whichever ones are listening, drop one in my lap." Mormont leaned forward. "You want to earn your keep in my castle, in this world you claim not to understand? Prove what you told Snow wasn't chance. There's a ranging going out at first light. Small, close to the wall, nothing beyond our usual patrol range. You'll go with them. You'll show me what a silver blade is worth against the true dead, not just the one you got lucky with in the dark." Geralt thought of 100 reasons to refuse, that this wasn't his war, that he'd learned the hard way what it cost to attach himself to causes larger than a contract's clean edges, that every instinct built over decades screamed at him to find the fastest way home instead of the fastest way into someone else's apocalypse. He thought of Kaer Morhen, and Ciri, and the particular ache of being pulled into Destiny's orbit against his will, over and over, no matter how many times he swore he was done with it. Then he thought of the White's dead blue eyes, and the purpose behind its reaching hands, and the medallion at his throat that hadn't stopped humming its low warning since he'd woken in the snow. A warning, he now understood, not for one dead man, but for everything gathering in the dark beyond that wall. "Fine," he said. "But I'll want my sword back before I bleed for your cause." For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of respect crossed Mormont's weathered face. "Give the man his blade," he told the steward, and to Geralt, "Welcome to the Night's Watch's problem, Witcher. I hope, for both our sakes, that it's smaller than it looks." Geralt didn't answer that. He'd learned long ago that hope was a luxury best rationed carefully, and that problems in the dark were rarely smaller than they looked. Outside, the wall groaned, a low, ancient sound, like ice settling under a weight it had carried for 8,000 years and was only now beginning to doubt it could bear. The ranging left at first light through a gate cut into the ice itself, a narrow tunnel that groaned and shifted overhead as they passed beneath 700 feet of frozen weight. And Geralt found himself doing something he rarely bothered with anymore, praying, in the vague, professional way of a man who didn't believe any god was listening but saw no harm in covering his bets. 6 men rode out with him. Ed, a younger ranger named Gren, broad-shouldered and nervous in a way he tried to disguise with bravado. 3 others whose names Geralt filed away without much investment, on the theory, grim, practical, born of 2 decades in the killing trade, that not all of them would be riding back. John led them, though Geralt noted he wasn't the eldest or the most senior. Something in the way the others deferred to him suggested a competence that had outpaced his years, the kind Geralt recognized because he'd worn it himself once, a young man too capable for anyone's comfort, including his own. "Territory beyond the wall doesn't work the way you'd expect," John told him as they rode, the pale trees closing overhead in a canopy the color of old blood. "Distances lie, time lies. Men who've ranged here 20 years still get turned around. Comforting. It's not meant to be." John's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, just honest. Geralt appreciated honesty more than comfort, as a rule. He rode in silence a while, cataloging the forest with the systematic attention of a professional, the absence of birdsong, the way even the wind seemed to move reluctantly, the cold that deepened rather than eased as the sun, weak and distant, climbed toward its low apex. Somewhere in the marrow of this land, something ancient was awake and paying attention, and every instinct he'd honed over decades of contract work told him it already knew he was here. They found the first sign of trouble by mid-afternoon. A ranger's abandoned camp, fire long dead, supplies scattered, as though the owner had left mid-meal and never returned. John crouched over the ash, expression unreadable. "Benjen's man," he said quietly. "This was Yarwick's fire. How long?" 3 days, maybe 4. John stood, scanning the tree line with the particular tension Geralt recognized from 100 contracts gone sideways, the look of a man recalculating the odds of a job he'd thought was simple. "We should turn back. Report this to the Lord Commander. Or," Geralt said, "we could find out what happened to him while the trail's still readable, instead of losing another 2 days coming back out here after it's snowed over and gone cold." He crouched beside the ash himself, ran gloved fingers through it, found beneath the surface ash a thread of black wool, snagged and torn, pulled, not cut. Something took him. Didn't kill him here, or there'd be more blood, more struggle. Dragged him, or he ran. John studied him with new interest. You track. Where I'm from, most contracts start with finding the thing before you can kill it. Tracking's half the trade. Geralt straightened, following the faint disturbance in the frost-crusted undergrowth. Footprints, dragging, the particular broken branch signature of something moving with purpose rather than panic. This way, the others exchanged glances. Ed's hand found his sword hilt. Following that trail's how 6 men become 12 corpses. Following that trail, Geralt said, without looking back, is how you find out what you're actually facing before it finds you first. Your choice, which you'd rather do. They followed him. He understood, distantly, that something had shifted in the balance of the group, that a stranger with no rank, no oath, no claim on their loyalty had just given an order and been obeyed, and that this fact would have consequences he hadn't fully calculated. He filed that thought away too, alongside the growing, uncomfortable awareness that he was making decisions like a man invested in the outcome rather than a man simply passing through. The trail led them to a hollow beneath a shelf of ice, and what they found there stopped even Geralt's professional detachment cold. Yarwick hung from a low branch, arranged, not killed, not left, arranged, limbs spread in a pattern that meant something to whoever had done it, though Geralt couldn't read the grammar of it yet. Around him, in a careful circle pressed into the snow, lay the bodies of small animals, birds, a fox, things too deliberately placed to be scavengers' leavings. And at the center of the pattern, driven into the frozen earth, stood something that made even the hardened rangers go pale and silent. A spiral, carved from ice, that didn't melt despite the pale winter sun overhead, radiating a cold that Geralt could feel through his boots, through his mutated resistance to weather no ordinary man could survive. Gods, Gren whispered. Gods, that's one of their marks. Whose mark? Geralt asked, already circling the hollow's perimeter, cataloging the pattern with the same clinical attention he'd have given any ritual site on the continent. Location, materials, intent. Ritual magic left signatures, regardless of what world you practiced it in. This one screamed of purpose, of communication, of a message left for something else to read. The White Walkers. John's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the voice of a man holding fear at arm's length through sheer discipline. This is how they mark a kill, a warning, or a summons. We don't fully understand it. Geralt crouched at the spiral's edge, close enough to feel its cold radiating against his exposed skin, and let his witcher senses, dulled here, static fuzzed by whatever interference this world's ancient magic exerted on his own, strain toward whatever truth the ice held. He caught fragments, intention, vast and patient and utterly without malice in the way mortals understood malice, the way a glacier isn't malicious as it grinds a valley to dust. This wasn't hatred, it was process, something ancient, doing what it had always done, indifferent to the men caught in its path. It's not angry, he said slowly, working the thought out loud. Whatever did this, there's no rage in it. It's deliberate, considered, like a farmer marking which fields to harvest next. The rangers stared at him. How would you know that? Ed demanded, from a bloody carving in the ice. Because I've spent 20 years learning to read what monsters leave behind, and this one left something worse than a threat. Geralt stood, brushing frost from his knees. It left a message it expects someone to understand. The question is whether that someone is you people, or something else entirely. John's jaw tightened. We need to get Yarwick's body back. Give him proper rest, and we need to warn the wall. This is closer to Castle Black than any mark we've found before. Closer, Geralt agreed, and I'd wager not by accident. He looked north, past the hollow, toward a horizon lost in gray haze, and felt his medallion's low thrum sharpen for just a moment into something almost like a spike, a flicker of attention, vast and cold, brushing against his awareness and withdrawing before he could fully grasp its shape. Something out there had noticed him noticing it. They cut Yarwick down in grim silence, wrapped him for the journey back, and Geralt helped without being asked. Another small erosion of the professional distance he'd sworn to maintain. Another thread pulling him deeper into a war he'd told himself, less than 2 days ago, wasn't his to fight. The ride back to the wall was faster, tenser, every man scanning the tree line with the particular alertness of soldiers who now knew, with certainty, that they were being watched. Geralt rode near the rear, turning the spiral's meaning over in his mind, and found himself doing something he hadn't done in longer than he cared to admit. Genuinely wondering how this ended, rather than simply calculating the fastest exit. That worried him more than the white had. He'd built a life, a whole hard-won philosophy, around not caring how things ended beyond the closing of a contract. Somewhere between the white in the forest and the spiral in the ice, that philosophy had started, quietly, to crack. Behind them, unseen, the hollow's cold lingered long after they'd gone, patient, deliberate, already turning its slow attention toward the gates of Castle Black and the stranger who had read its message correctly. They brought Yarwick's body through the gate at dusk, and Castle Black's mood shifted the moment word spread of the spiral in the ice. Geralt had seen fear move through garrisons before, the particular contagion of dread that outpaces facts, that turns careful men brittle. What struck him here was how quickly that fear organized itself into faction, into blame, into the old, tired human instinct to find someone to be angry at when the real enemy was too vast and too cold to strike back against. Some of that anger found him. "You led them straight to it," said a broad-shouldered ranger named Thorn, cornering Geralt near the armory, 2 days after their return, flanked by 2 others, with the particular swagger of men who'd decided a stranger made a safer target than the true enemy. A man walks out of the haunted forest with a foreign blade, and not 4 days later we've got Yarwick strung up like a hog and a mark on the ice, closer to our walls than any we've found in a generation. Seems a strange coincidence. Seems, Geralt agreed, not moving from where he stood cleaning his silver blade with the patient, unhurried motion of a man who had faced down worse threats than wounded pride. Like you're looking for someone easier to hate than the thing that actually killed him. Thorn's hand drifted toward his sword hilt. Geralt didn't reach for his own. Didn't need to. 20 years of reading violence before it arrived had taught him the difference between a man about to draw steel and a man performing the theater of almost drawing it for an audience. Thorn was the latter. Still, the room went taut, several nearby rangers pausing their work to watch. "You don't belong here," Thorn said. "Whatever you are, whatever hole you crawled out of." "No," Geralt said. "I don't. I've been saying as much since I arrived." He set down the whetstone, met Thorn's eyes without heat, without apology. "But I killed the thing that would have killed me before your watch found me. And I found your dead ranger's trail when your own trackers were ready to turn back, rather than follow it. If you'd rather I hadn't, say so plainly, and I'll be on my way the moment I find a road out of this frozen hole that leads somewhere I recognize." It was John who broke the standoff, arriving with the particular authority of a man who'd earned deference through competence rather than rank. "Stand down, Sir Alistair. We don't have men enough to spare for grudges." Thorn's glare shifted, briefly, unmistakably, toward John, and Geralt understood, with the flat clarity of an outsider reading a room's true fault lines, that the resentment aimed at him was only partly about him at all. Some of it belonged to older wounds, John's parentage, his rapid rise, whatever politics simmered beneath this castle's surface that had nothing to do with whites or spirals or dead men in the snow. Geralt had wandered, without meaning to, into the middle of someone else's long grudge. "This isn't finished," Thorn said, and withdrew with his men, the theater of the threat intact even in retreat. "Friendly place," Geralt observed, once they'd gone. "It's a place full of men who expected to die forgotten, guarding a wall nobody south of here believes needs guarding," John said. "Fear does strange things to men already halfway to despair." He studied Geralt a moment. "For what it's worth, you did find the trail faster than any of us would have. Doesn't sound like it's worth much, judging by the reception. It's worth something to me." John's voice carried a weight Geralt was beginning to recognize. The particular loneliness of a man too capable for the company he kept, too honest for the games being played around him. "Come with me. There's someone beyond the wall I want you to meet, if you're willing to ride out again. Wildlings, we call them, free folk who don't answer to the Watch or any southern lord. They don't trust easily, but they don't waste time on politics either, and after Thorn's little performance, I suspect you'll find that a relief. Geralt considered the offer, weighing what little he understood of this world's factions. Politics, he'd learned over 2 decades of contract work, was the same poison in every world he'd ever set foot in. Different names, same mechanism, men leveraging fear and hierarchy to protect their own narrow interests while the actual monster went about its business unbothered. He'd take honest hostility over performed loyalty any day. "Lead on," he said. They rode out the following dawn with a small escort. Ed, Gren, 2 others, north beyond the wall's shadow, into territory the Watch rarely traveled without a full-ranging party. The land here felt different to Geralt's senses, wilder, less structured by the ancient wards he'd felt pressing against his signs near the wall itself. His medallion's constant thrum eased, marginally, the farther they traveled from Castle Blackstone. Evidence, he suspected, that whatever ancient magic reinforced the wall's wards treated his own power as background static, to be dampened regardless of intent. They found the wildling camp by midday, a scattering of tents and lean-tos arranged with a practicality that spoke of people who'd learned to break camp fast and often, sentries positioned with more genuine competence than Geralt had expected from a group the Watch dismissed as savages. A woman with a spear met them at the tree line, flanked by 2 younger men with bows already drawn. "Crow," she said, eyes flicking over John with open suspicion, before settling on Geralt with something sharper. "Assessment, not hostility. You've brought a stranger." "Egret," John said. "This is Geralt. He's not Watch. Not Southern either, truth be told. He's not from anywhere you or I could point to on a map." Egret's gaze didn't waver from Geralt's face. "You killed a white clean," they're saying. "In the haunted forest. Alone. News travels fast for a place with no ravens. Free folk talk to free folk, faster than your crows think." A faint, wary respect crossed her expression. The specific regard, Geralt recognized, of a warrior sizing up another warrior. "You don't kneel to kings. Don't bow to no Lord Commander, either, from what I hear." "Never seen the appeal," Geralt admitted. "Kings make promises they don't keep, and expect gratitude for the lie." Something like a smile touched Egret's mouth. Brief, genuine, the first unguarded expression he'd seen from anyone in this world since he'd woken in the snow. "Might be you and I understand each other better than you and the crows do." She lowered her spear, though the men at her flanks kept their bows ready. "Come, Mance will want to hear how a man who bows to no one killed one of the dead without dragonglass or fire. Might be you're more used to the free folk than you know." They walked into camp, and Geralt found himself, not for the first time in this strange cold world, recalculating what kind of story he'd fallen into. Among the Watch he was a tool, tested and half-trusted, tangled in politics not his own. Among the free folk, he sensed something closer to kinship, people who'd built their entire way of life around refusing another man's chains, who might understand, better than any sworn brother of the Night's Watch, why a witcher spent his whole life walking roads that belonged to no crown. Mance Rayder received him around a low fire that evening, and Geralt understood within moments why this man commanded 100 clans that owed him nothing but respect earned rather than demanded. Mance listened more than he spoke, weighed Geralt's account of the spiral in the ice with the grim attention of a commander who'd already guessed the shape of the war coming and was simply gathering confirmation. "You know what's coming," Mance said finally. "Better than the crows do, I think. Better than most of my own people want to admit. I know what a monster looks like when it's not hunting for hunger or hatred." Geralt said. "This is neither. It's something patient. Something that's done this before and will do it again, regardless of what any of us decide tonight." Mance's eyes, in the firelight, carried the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent years trying to unite 100 stubborn clans against a threat most of the world still refused to believe in. "The free folk have been running from that thing for longer than the 7 kingdoms have existed. We're done running. I mean to get my people south, past the wall, whatever it costs, before the true winter comes for all of us, crow and wildling alike, and there's no one left standing to remember there was ever a difference." Geralt looked around the fire, at faces hardened by a lifetime spent surviving something the rest of the world dismissed as myth, and felt the last of his careful neutrality crack a little further. He'd told himself, less than a week into this world, that this wasn't his war. He was beginning to understand that in a world facing true extinction, that particular luxury might not exist for anyone. Witcher or wildling, crow or king. If I'm going to be stuck fighting a war I didn't choose, he said finally, I'd rather do it beside people honest enough to admit that's what it is. Mance studied him a long moment, then nodded, slow and deliberate, the gesture of a man sealing something more binding than a handshake. Then welcome to the free folks problem, Witcher. Gods know we could use a blade that doesn't care whose banner it flies. Outside the firelight's reach, the cold pressed closer, patient as ever, and somewhere far to the north, something vast and ancient turned its attention, for the second time, toward the stranger who kept refusing to stay out of its way. The attack came 3 nights later, and it came without the courtesy of warning. Geralt had been sitting apart from the main camp, running a whetstone along his silver blade by the low light of a banked fire, when his medallion's constant low thrum spiked into something sharp enough to make him go still mid-stroke. He'd learned to trust that sensation across 2 decades of contract work. The difference between background dread and imminent violence was a distinction his mutated senses had been bred to make, and this was unmistakably the latter. "Egret," he said, quiet but urgent, to the woman keeping watch near the tree line. "Something's coming." She didn't question him. That alone told Geralt how far his standing among the free folk had risen in 3 short days. Enough that a warrior who'd known him less than a week trusted his instincts over her own eyes. She raised the alarm with a sharp, carrying whistle that rippled through the camp, and within moments the scattered fires were kicked to embers, weapons drawn, the practiced chaos of a people who had drilled for exactly this too many times to count. They came out of the tree line in a ragged wave, not the single purposeful wight Geralt had killed in the haunted forest, but a dozen, 2 dozen, shambling with that same terrible unified intent, eyes burning that same drowned winter blue. Among them, worse, moved things that had once been larger, a bear, reanimated and hollow-eyed, its dead flesh moving with an unnatural fluidity that made even the hardened free-folk warriors flinch back. Geralt moved without thinking, silver blade already clearing its sheath, and reached instinctively for Igni, the fire sign, second nature after decades of muscle memory, the reflex of a man who'd burned back 1,000 threats with a flick of 2 fingers and a murmured word. He shaped the sign, felt the familiar gathering of will behind his sternum, and nothing happened. Or worse than nothing, a stuttering, half-formed flare that guttered out before it left his fingertips, like a wet match struck against damp stone. A wight was already closing on his left flank. Geralt abandoned the sign entirely and cut it down with silver and simple technique instead, the ancient, reliable economy of a blade doing what magic had failed to do. But the failure cost him a half-second's hesitation he couldn't afford twice, and he felt the cold graze of clawed fingers rake across his shoulder before he spun free and finished the thing with a reverse strike. Around him, the fight had become a brutal press, free folk warriors fighting with spears and axes, their blows landing true, but doing nothing more than slowing the wights down, forcing them back a step before the relentless things simply kept coming. Egret's arrows found throats and skulls with expert precision, but the wights didn't die from wounds that would fell any living man. They only stopped when the damage was catastrophic enough. And even then, Geralt watched one crawl forward on shattered legs, still reaching, until someone finally put a spear through what remained of its skull. Fire. Mance's voice cut across the chaos, hoarse with command. "Get fire on them now!" Geralt understood the wisdom even as his own fire sign continued to fail him. 3 more attempts, 3 more stuttering flickers, the magic simply refusing to cohere the way it always had, as though something vast and cold were reaching into the shape of his will and smothering it before it could catch. He'd felt interference before, in his own world, anti-magic zones, cursed ground, the specific dampening effect of certain ancient ruins, but nothing that fought him this consistently, this completely, as though the very ground beneath his boots resented the shape of foreign power trying to assert itself. He abandoned signs entirely and reached instead for the oil flask at his belt, one of the alchemical preparations he'd carried since before the portal had ever swallowed him. A witcher's toolkit didn't rely solely on magic, and in that fact, he found sudden, desperate relief. He splashed the oil across his blade's edge, struck flint against steel with practiced speed, and set the silver alight with honest fire rather than sorcerous flame. The burning blade cut through the next white, and the corpse caught properly this time, flame licking hungrily along dead, frost-dry flesh, the thing collapsing into genuine, final stillness as the fire consumed whatever unnatural animation had held it upright. Something in the pattern clicked into place for Geralt even as he fought. Fire works, plain fire, it doesn't care whose hand holds the torch. And he shouted the observation across the chaos, in case it saved a life he had no other way to protect. Burn them! Fire, not steel. Steel just slows them down. The free folk, already half aware of the lesson through hard experience, adapted fast. Torches were snatched from the dying campfires, oil-soaked cloth wrapped around spear tips, and lit in desperate haste, and the tide of the fight began, gradually, to turn. Not because of Geralt's magic, which continued to fail him at every attempted casting, but because of the oldest tool his profession had ever relied upon: chemistry, preparation, the patient stockpiling of alchemical answers to problems that predated any particular world's rules. The reanimated bear proved the fight's true crisis, vast, nearly unkillable by conventional means, scattering warriors with blows that shattered bone through raised shields. Geralt met it with burning blade and every scrap of witcher reflex he possessed, ducking beneath a swipe that would have taken his head, driving the flaming silver deep into the thing's throat, and twisting until dead muscle finally, reluctantly, released whatever cold animation drove it. It collapsed in a heap of burning fur, and the last of the wights, deprived of whatever coordinating will had driven the assault, fell into uncoordinated chaos. Easier prey now, for warriors who'd learned in the space of one brutal skirmish exactly what killed these things and what merely delayed them. When the last wight finally stopped moving, the camp lay scattered with bodies, some free folk dead among the burning white corpses, wounds too severe for even Geralt's practiced field triage to address. Ygritte found him afterward, breathing hard, blood, not his own, mostly, streaked across her face, and studied the singed, oil-slicked blade in his hand with new understanding. "Your magic failed you," she said. Not an accusation, an observation, offered with the blunt honesty he'd come to associate with the free folk's particular brand of respect. It did. Geralt cleaned his blade with methodical care, buying himself a moment to organize the thought properly. Whatever holds this place together, your old gods, or whatever's woven into that wall's ancient wards, it doesn't recognize my kind of power, treats it like noise, like something to be smothered rather than understood. He sheathed the blade, the admission costing him something he wasn't accustomed to giving up easily. "I'll need to relearn how I fight if I mean to be any use to you beyond a sword arm and a flask of oil." "A sword arm and a flask of oil killed more of those things tonight than any magic I've ever seen," Mance said, approaching with the grim satisfaction of a commander counting a battle survived rather than won. "Might be that's lesson enough for tonight. Whatever raised those things, it's testing us, probing how close it can press before the wall's wards or the watch's swords push back." His gaze swept the scattered dead, expression hardening. "It'll come again. Harder. Next time." Geralt looked north, toward a darkness that felt, for the first time since he'd woken in this world's cold, genuinely aware of him. Not the vague ambient dread that had followed him since the portal, but something specific, something that had watched tonight's fight and was already recalculating. "Then I'd better learn this world's rules faster than it expects me to," Geralt said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised him. The last honest remnant of his old neutrality burning away as surely as the wights had, consumed by a fire that asked no permission and cared nothing for which world had lit the match. Behind him, the weirwood red dawn began to break over a camp counting its dead, and somewhere far to the north, patient and ancient and newly, specifically interested, the true enemy of this world took careful note of a stranger who had just proven fire wasn't the only weapon he carried, and that he was, against every instinct that had governed his life until now, choosing to stay and learn the rest. They burned their dead the next morning, And Geralt stood at the edge of the ceremony with the particular stillness of a man who had witnessed 100 funerals across 100 contracts, and never quite grown accustomed to the specific grief of people who buried their own. Mance spoke words in the old tongue that Geralt didn't understand, and didn't need to. Grief, he'd learned long ago, translated across every world without difficulty. It was in the aftermath, picking through the wreckage of the White Assault, that Geralt found the thing his profession had trained him to look for above all else, the pattern beneath the chaos, the shape of a monster's true nature, hiding inside the horror of its methods. He crouched over the ashes of the reanimated bear, prodding through burnt fur and bone with the clinical detachment of a man conducting an autopsy, and Ygritte watched him work with a curiosity that had, over the past days, softened into something closer to partnership. "You're looking for something," she said. "Always." Geralt extracted a fragment of bone, turned it over in gloved fingers, studying the way the marrow had crystallized into something that wasn't quite ice, and wasn't quite anything he had a name for. On the continent, every monster follows rules, even the ones that look like chaos. Something animates it, something sustains it, something can kill it permanently rather than just slowing it down. I've spent 5 days assuming you're dead or simple reanimation. Puppetry, the kind necromancers back home practice. I don't think that's right anymore. What do you think it is? I think, Geralt said slowly, turning the fragment toward the weak morning light, that whatever raises these things isn't animating dead flesh so much as replacing what made it alive in the first place. There's no rot here, no natural decay, even days after death. That's not preservation. Every necromantic working I've encountered eventually loses the fight against entropy. This isn't losing. This is a different kind of alive, laid over the corpse like a new coat of paint over old wood. He looked up, meeting Ygritte's eyes, which means killing the reanimation isn't the same as killing whatever's actually driving it. Fire works because fire destroys the vessel entirely, burns away the paint along with the wood. But the will behind it, the source, that's somewhere else. Something's directing all of this from a distance, and every white we burn is just it losing a single glove, not a hand. Ygritte's expression darkened with the weary understanding of someone confirming a fear she'd carried a long time without proof. The White Walkers. You're talking about the White Walkers. I haven't seen one yet. Only what they've made. Geralt stood, pocketing the bone fragment out of professional habit. Data, however grim, was worth keeping. But everything about this feels coordinated in a way scattered dead men reanimating on instinct wouldn't be. Someone, or something, is commanding an army. That's not a haunting. That's a war, and we've only seen its scouts. They brought the theory to Mance that evening, and the king beyond the wall listened with the grave attention of a man who had spent years piecing together fragments of exactly this picture from 100 different sources. Old songs, older wounds, the testimony of clans that had encountered the true White Walkers and lost most of their number in the process. "You're not telling me anything the free folk haven't suspected for generations," Mance said, "but you're the first outsider to arrive at it through reasoning I recognize as sound, rather than superstition passed down through bad translation." He studied Geralt with the calculating respect of a leader assessing a resource he hadn't expected to acquire. "What would you do, Witcher, facing a monster like this on your own continent, one that commands an army instead of hunting alone?" Geralt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd find its source." Every plague has a source, a nest, a first cause, something that if destroyed unravels everything built on top of it. Contracts like that, you don't win by killing every symptom one at a time. You find the disease and you cut it out. And if the source is something no blade, silver or otherwise, has ever managed to kill, then I'd find out what does work, Geralt said, before I ran out of allies willing to die learning that lesson the hard way. Mance's jaw tightened, some private calculation passing behind his eyes. There's a man among the free folk, was a free folk, before he wandered too far north chasing a woman he shouldn't have loved. Craster keeps a keep of sorts beyond here, trades with anyone desperate enough to brave his hospitality. If anyone this side of the wall has seen a White Walker up close and lived to describe it in more than fever dream fragments, it's men who've passed through Craster's gate and come back changed. He met Geralt's eyes. "I'd send you there myself, but Craster doesn't welcome armed strangers easily, and there's history between his keep and mine I won't burden you with." "Then I'll go without an introduction," Geralt said. "I've talked my way past worse doors than one bitter man's threshold." It was John, arriving from Castle Black with fresh news and fresh urgency, who complicated the plan further. He found Geralt at the camp's edge the following dawn, expression grim in a way that told its own story before he spoke a word. "Mormont's called for you," John said. "There's word from the wall. A party returning from deeper ranging brought back something the Lord Commander wants your eyes on personally." He wouldn't say what, only that it changes things. Geralt exchanged a glance with Ygritte, feeling the pull of two obligations diverging at once: the Free Folk's fragile, hard-won trust, and the Watch's institutional authority, both wanting a piece of him for their own separate purposes. This, he understood with weary clarity, was the true shape of Westeros's particular curse. Even facing extinction, no two factions could simply pool their desperation into a single unified effort. Everyone still played their own game, even against the ending of the world. "I'll go," he told John. "But I'm not abandoning what we started here." He turned to Mance. "Whatever the Watch shows me, I'll bring back what's useful. You have my word on that, for whatever a stranger's word is worth to you." "More than most southern lords manage to keep," Mance said. "And that's setting a low bar you've already cleared twice over." He extended a hand, free folk custom rather than southern courtesy, and Geralt clasped it. "Go see what the crows have found, but remember where your allies actually are, Witcher, when the politics start pulling at you the way it always does." The ride back to Castle Black felt different than Geralt's first journey through these woods. Less a passage through unknown, hostile territory, more a return to ground he'd begun, against every hard-won instinct, to think of as familiar. John rode beside him in comfortable silence for the first stretch, then broke it with the careful tone of a man raising something that had been weighing on him. "You've made an impression on the free folk," John said. "More than most crows manage in a lifetime of trying. They're honest about what they want, refreshing, after Thorn's little performance. That honesty's going to cost you standing with some at the wall when they hear how close you've grown to wildling company." John's voice carried old weariness, the specific fatigue of a man caught permanently between factions that refuse to see each other's worth. Politics doesn't stop just because the true enemy's at the gate. "I wish it did. I've hoped it might, every season since I first understood what's actually coming for all of us. I've learned that lesson in every world I've ever set foot in," Geralt said. "Politics is the disease men catch when they haven't yet been frightened badly enough by the actual monster. Give it time. Your world's about to get considerably more frightening." John's laugh was short, humorless, but genuine. "That's meant to be comforting? It's meant to be honest," Geralt said. "I've found people manage crises better once they stop lying to themselves about the shape of the danger. Whatever Mormont's found, I suspect we're about to stop lying." Ahead, Castle Black's dark silhouette rose against a sky the color of old iron, the wall beyond it vast and silent and waiting, and Geralt felt his medallion's constant thrum sharpen once more. Not the ambient dread of before, but something closer to certainty, the particular clarity of a Witcher closing in on the true shape of a contract he'd never agreed to take and could no longer imagine walking away from. Mormont received him in the same torchlit hall as before, though the mood had shifted into something graver, tauter. Waiting alongside the Lord Commander stood a woman Geralt hadn't yet met, red-robed despite the killing cold, skin pale as the weirwood bark that grew beyond the wall, eyes that seemed to hold banked fire even in the guttering torchlight. She studied Geralt with an intensity that made even his hardened composure prickle with old, professional wariness. He'd met sorceresses before. He knew the particular danger of someone who saw the world as a collection of signs and omens rather than people. "This is the Lady Melisandre," Mormont said, without warmth. "She arrived 3 days past, claims to serve something called the Lord of Light. She's asked to see the stranger who killed a wight with silver steel." "Asked," Melisandre said, in a voice that carried the faint cadence of somewhere far from Westeros. "Isn't quite accurate, Lord Commander. I was told to seek him, by the only voice I trust to speak truth." Her gaze never left Geralt's face, and he felt, uncomfortably, the sensation of being read rather than simply observed, the specific violation of someone parsing him for meaning he hadn't offered. Relor showed me your shadow in the flames 3 nights past. A man who walks between worlds, carrying 2 blades and no god. I'll grant the 2 blades, Geralt said. The rest sounds like a story you've decided to tell, regardless of what's actually standing in front of you. Something that might have been amusement crossed her ageless face. Skepticism. How refreshing, and how familiar. I've met 100 men who doubted the flames before the flames proved them wrong. She stepped closer, close enough that Geralt caught the scent of ash and something floral beneath it, incongruous in this cold place. You don't believe in the Lord of Light. You don't believe in the old gods or the Seven, or any god this world worships. And yet something walked you through a door between realities and set you down in exactly the place where the war for the dawn is beginning. Do you truly believe that was chance? I believe, Geralt said, that portals are unstable, and I was standing too close to the wrong ritual at the wrong moment. Destiny's a story people tell themselves to make chaos feel like design. I've had enough of that story shoved down my throat in my own world to recognize the shape of it here. And yet you stayed, Melisandre said softly. You could have spent these past days searching for a way home, instead of riding beside wildlings and rangers, learning this war's shape as though you meant to fight it. That isn't chance either, Witcher. That's choice. And I've learned, across centuries of watching men choose, that the ones the flames show me rarely choose by accident. Geralt held her gaze and said nothing, because there was an uncomfortable grain of truth buried in her theatrical certainty that he didn't care to examine too closely. Not here, not in front of an audience. He'd spent his life resisting the pull of prophecy, resenting every time Destiny's fingers closed around his choices and called it fate. He wasn't about to hand this stranger the satisfaction of thinking she'd found another prophecy fulfilled. Mormont, visibly impatient with the exchange, cut through it with blunt practicality. Whatever the lady believes about gods and flames, I called you here for something more immediate. He gestured to a table where a ranger's cloak lay spread, torn and frost-stiffened. Beside it, a scattering of objects recovered from a body Geralt understood, without needing to ask, hadn't survived whatever encounter had claimed it. Benjen Stark's party, first ranger, gone missing for weeks. We found this much of him and nothing more. No body, no blade, only what the cold left behind. Geralt examined the cloak with professional care, noting the pattern of the tears. Not claw marks, not the ragged violence of a wight's attack, but something colder, more precise, as though the fabric itself had simply stopped existing where something impossibly cold had touched it. This wasn't the dead that did this, he said slowly. Nothing about this pattern matches what we fought 3 nights past. No, Melisandre agreed, and for the first time her theatrical certainty gave way to something that sounded almost like genuine dread. This is them. The White Walkers themselves, not their servants. I've seen echoes of them in the flames. Tall, pale, eyes like winter's own cruelty, blades of ice that shatter steel and leave nothing behind but cold. She looked to Geralt with new urgency. The flames show me fragments, never the whole truth. But they've shown me this much clearly: the White Walkers move now with purpose they haven't shown in living memory. Something has changed. Something has drawn their full attention south, toward the wall, in a way the old songs never described. Something, Mormont said grimly. Or someone. The weight of the room's attention settled on Geralt with uncomfortable precision, and he understood, with the flat clarity of a man recognizing a trap closing around him regardless of his own choices, exactly what they were suggesting. You think I'm the reason, he said. I think, Mormont said carefully, that a stranger fell through a tear in reality mere days before the White Walkers began moving, with a purpose no living ranger has ever witnessed. I don't believe in coincidence any more than the lady does, though I dress my suspicion in more practical clothes than prophecy. Geralt considered arguing, considered the dozen reasons his arrival and the White Walkers' movements might be unrelated. Coincidence, unrelated causes. The simple fact that an 8,000-year-old threat didn't need a stranger's presence to justify escalating. But he'd learned, across 2 decades of contract work, that dismissing a client's suspicion outright rarely earned trust, and trust was worth more to him now than pride. "If I'm the reason," he said instead, "then I owe this world a debt I didn't ask for, and I'll pay it the only way I know how, by finding out exactly what's coming and killing as much of it as I can before it reaches your gate." He looked to Melisandre. "Your flames, can they show you where, not just that something's coming, but where it means to strike first?" "Flames rarely answer such precise questions," Melisandre admitted, "but R'hllor has shown me glimpses of ice meeting fire in this very place, at this very wall. Whether that vision is prophecy or possibility, I cannot say with certainty. The future is not written in stone, Witcher, only in shifting light, and shifting light can be changed by the choices men make before the flame's truth comes to pass." "Then let's give your god something worth changing," Geralt said, and turned to Mormont. "I'll need everything you know about how Valyrian steel and dragonglass actually kill these things. Not songs, not superstition, but whatever practical knowledge your maesters have managed to preserve. If I'm going to face something that shatters ordinary steel and leaves nothing behind but cold, I want every advantage available before it finds me instead of the reverse." Mormont's expression carried the particular relief of a commander who'd finally found someone willing to treat the crisis with the seriousness it demanded, rather than either panic or denial. "I'll have the maester bring what records survive. It isn't much. The Citadel's never put much stock in what the Watch reports about the true enemy." "It rarely does," Melisandre said, with the weary bitterness of someone who'd spent centuries fighting institutional disbelief. "The Citadel trusts parchment over prophecy, and prophecy over the testimony of frightened men who've seen the dead walk. That disbelief has cost this world more than its scholars will ever admit." She studied Geralt once more, that unsettling reading gaze returning. "You'll fight beside us then. Truly, and not merely as a curiosity the Lord Commander keeps testing against whites." "I'll fight," Geralt confirmed, "because I've seen what's coming, and I don't trust anyone else in this castle to stop it without help." "Not because your god showed you my shadow in a fire." He held her gaze, letting the correction land plainly. "I'd be grateful if you kept that distinction clear, going forward. I've spent my whole life being someone else's chosen instrument. I'd rather this once be simply a man who chose to stay." Melisandre's expression flickered, something unreadable, perhaps disappointment, perhaps a patience that expected time to prove her right regardless of his protest. "As you say, Witcher, choice or destiny, the flames rarely care which name men give their purpose, only that the purpose is served." Outside, beyond the hall's narrow windows, the wall groaned again in the deepening cold, and somewhere north of it, in territory no living ranger had mapped and returned to describe, something ancient and patient continued its slow, deliberate advance toward a war that had, whether by chance or design, acquired a new and unpredictable variable. The choice found him 11 days later, and it arrived with none of the drama Geralt had learned to expect from Westeros's particular flavor of catastrophe. No spiral in the ice, no burning white bear crashing through a camp. It arrived instead as a quiet, desperate ranger stumbling through Castle Black's gate at dawn, half frozen, reporting that a column of free folk refugees, 300 souls, Mance's people, women and children, and the elderly among them, had been caught in the open 2 days' hard ride north, pinned between an advancing white vanguard and a frozen lake too thin to cross safely. Mormont convened his officers within the hour, Geralt among them now by unspoken right, and the maps spread across the table told a story with only bad answers written into its geography. "Two forces," the ranger reported, voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "The refugee column, and 8 miles south of them, trapped between 2 ridgelines, what's left of a watch patrol. Gren's men, cut off during a routine sweep 3 days back. 12 rangers, maybe fewer now. Both groups sent word asking for rescue. We don't have riders enough to reach both before the whites close the distance on one or the other." The silence that followed had the particular density of men doing arithmetic they didn't want to finish. "The patrol are sworn brothers," Thorne said immediately, his earlier hostility toward Geralt forgotten in the face of a decision that mattered more. "Watch men, our own. The wildlings chose to be beyond the wall in the first place. That's the risk of the life they've picked. 300 souls against 12, John said, sharp with an anger he didn't bother disguising. Women, children, you'd leave them to die because they don't wear black? I'd save the men who swore an oath to this castle first, Thorn shot back, because that oath means something, and if it stops meaning something the moment convenience demands otherwise, then the watch is nothing but pretty words on dying men's lips. Mormont's gaze found Geralt across the table, not asking permission precisely, but weighing the outsider's read on a problem that had, by cruel necessity, become partly his to help solve, given how deeply entangled he'd become with both parties now trapped in the cold. Geralt studied the map with a particular cold clarity he'd trained into himself across 2 decades of contracts that never offered clean answers. Village elders demanding he choose between 2 equally doomed hamlets. Monarchs asking him to sacrifice 1 innocent life to save 100 others. The entire brutal arithmetic of survival that his profession had taught him to face without flinching, even when flinching was the more human response. "How many riders can you actually spare?" he asked. "And how fast?" "Honestly, not hopefully." 20 at most, without stripping the wall's own defense to nothing, Mormont said. Fast riders could reach the closer group, the patrol, by nightfall. The refugee column's another half-day beyond that, minimum, assuming the ice holds and nothing worse finds them first. Geralt did the math the way he'd done it 100 times before. Stripped of sentiment, stripped of the easy fiction that both groups might somehow be saved if only everyone tried hard enough. 20 riders, divided, saved no one. 20 riders, concentrated, might save one group cleanly, or might arrive at the farther group too late regardless, burning riders and horses on a rescue already lost by the time they reached it. "You send everyone to the patrol first," he said, and felt the words land in the room like a blade. Not because they're watch, and the wildlings aren't, because they're closer, because you can actually reach them before nightfall with certainty, and because arriving in time to save 12 is worth more than arriving too late to save either group. Then you push everything you have left toward the refugee column, knowing full well you might already be too late by the time you reach them. John's expression cracked with something between fury and grief. "You're condemning 300 people to save 12. "I'm giving 12 people certain rescue," Geralt said, holding John's gaze without flinching, because flinching now would cost lives rather than merely pride. Instead of gambling all 20 riders on a longer ride that might arrive too late for both groups and save no one at all. "I've made this calculation before, in villages that didn't have the luxury of clean choices. Spreading your rescue thin doesn't save more people. It usually just guarantees more deaths, spread across a wider tragedy. Those are Mance's people," John said, voice low and dangerous. "Egret's people. You'd let them die on arithmetic?" The accusation landed exactly where John intended it to, and Geralt absorbed it without argument, because there was no argument that made the choice feel less monstrous, only one that made it, marginally, the less catastrophic of 2 monstrous options. He thought of Egret's blunt honesty, her hard-won trust, the particular kinship he'd found among people who owed no crown their loyalty, and set that thought aside with the same brutal discipline he'd trained into himself across every contract that had ever demanded he choose between 2 versions of losing. "I'd rather 12 people live for certain than gamble everyone's lives on hope," he said. "That's not arithmetic. Instead of caring, John, that's what caring actually costs, when the world doesn't offer you an option where everyone survives." Mormont's decision, when it came, matched Geralt's cold calculus almost exactly. The 20 riders dispatched at speed toward the trapped patrol, with instructions to push onward toward the refugee column the moment the first rescue was resolved, whatever remained of daylight and horseflesh allowing. It was, Geralt understood, the decision a commander who'd buried too many men across too many winters had already been leaning toward before any outsider offered his grim confirmation. But the confirmation still cost something, standing there watching John's face harden into something that wasn't quite hatred, but stood uncomfortably close to it. Geralt rode with the rescue party himself, unwilling to let the decision remain purely theoretical, unwilling to let other men bear alone the weight of a calculation he'd helped make. They reached the trapped patrol as dusk fell, cutting through a thin white vanguard with brutal efficiency. Burning blades, coordinated fire, the hard lessons of the earlier skirmish paying grim dividends, and pulled 11 surviving rangers from a position that would have become a mass grave within hours. They pushed onward through the night toward the refugee column, and Geralt rode at the front with a dread he hadn't allowed himself to feel until the immediate crisis was resolved, until there was nothing left to do but wait and hope his arithmetic hadn't cost people he'd genuinely come to care about. They found the frozen lake at first light, and the refugee column still camped at its edge, battered, exhausted, having held their ground through the night behind a desperate ring of fire and spears, but alive. All of them. Mance's leadership and the wildlings' own hard-earned survival instincts had bought them the hours Geralt's calculation had gambled they might need. Ygritte found him among the arriving riders, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion, and studied him with an expression Geralt couldn't immediately read. "They told us how the choice got made," she said. "Who argued for us to wait?" Geralt braced for the accusation Jon had already leveled, prepared to accept it without argument, because he'd made the choice with clear eyes, and he wouldn't dishonor it now by flinching from its cost. "I'd have made the same choice," Ygritte said instead, quiet and certain. "Closer group first, always. That's not cruelty, Witcher. That's just how you keep people alive in a world that doesn't hand out mercy for free." She studied him a moment longer. "Though I'll wager it cost you something, making it. Crows like Thorn, they'd have made that call and slept easy. You didn't look easy at all, back at that table." "No," Geralt admitted. "I didn't." "Good," Ygritte said. And there was something almost gentle in the word, a recognition passing between two people who understood, in their bones, the particular weight of choices that had no clean answer. "Man who makes that call easy is a man I wouldn't trust to make it right the next time." She turned back toward the surviving column, toward the work of getting 300 exhausted souls the rest of the way to shelter. "Come on then. Long way still to the wall, and I doubt the dead are done testing us before we get there." Geralt followed, carrying the weight of a decision he knew, with the flat certainty of a man who'd made 100 similar choices across 2 decades of contracts he would carry a long time yet. Proof, if he'd needed it, that the last of his careful neutrality had burned away somewhere between the white in the forest and this frozen lake, replaced by something heavier and far more dangerous, genuine investment in whether these people, this world, survived what was coming. Behind them, the frozen lake groaned under shifting ice, and somewhere far to the north, patient beyond all mortal reckoning, the true enemy continued its advance, indifferent to the arithmetic of mercy, waiting only for the moment when all such calculations would cease to matter at all. The White Walkers came for the wall 3 weeks later, and they came the way Geralt had come to expect this world's true horrors arrived, not with the chaotic fury of the Whites they commanded, but with the patient, deliberate certainty of something that had waited 8,000 years and had learned, in that waiting, exactly how to make an ending feel inevitable. The scouts spotted them first at dusk, a column of cold moving south through the haunted forest that froze the very air ahead of it, trees splitting with sounds like breaking bone as the temperature plummeted in advance of their approach. Mormont's ravens carried the warning to every outpost along 100 miles of ice, and Castle Black emptied its garrison onto the wall's battlements with the grim efficiency of men who had trained their whole lives for a moment most of them had never truly believed would come. Geralt stood atop the wall itself, as full dark settled, silver blade at his hip, a second blade, steel this time, borrowed and unremarkable, kept for whatever among the coming horde, still qualified as merely human, sheathed beside it. Jon stood near him, the earlier coldness between them thawed by 3 weeks of shared preparation, of watching the man who'd made an impossible choice at that frozen lake work tirelessly to ensure it hadn't been the last impossible choice either of them would face. Ygritte and a contingent of free-folk warriors had come south through the tunnel gate at Mance's own insistence. Old enmity between wildling and crow set aside, however briefly, for a fight that made every other grievance look small. Melisandre stood apart, near a brazier that burned with unnatural steadiness despite the wind, murmuring prayers to a god Geralt still didn't believe in, though he'd stopped arguing the point weeks ago. Belief, he'd decided, mattered less than results. And whatever her god actually was, the woman's fire magic had proven useful enough, in preparation, that he'd set aside his skepticism in favor of practical alliance. There, John said, voice tight, and pointed north. They came out of the tree line like a tide of winter given shape and purpose. Whites first, hundreds of them, a shambling wave of reclaimed dead, moving with that same terrible unified intent Geralt had first witnessed weeks ago in miniature. And behind them, walking with unhurried, terrible grace across ground that seemed to freeze fresh beneath each footstep, came the White Walkers themselves. Geralt had faced monsters that defied easy categorization before. The Wild Hunt's riders, ancient and cruel, the ageless horrors that predated even elven memory. Nothing had prepared him fully for the specific wrongness of the White Walker's presence, visible even at distance. Tall, pale as fresh bone, moving with an economy that suggested not merely intelligence, but a form of patience so vast, it had stopped recognizing urgency as a concept worth entertaining. Their blades, when starlight caught them, gleamed with the particular translucent blue of deep glacier ice. "Gods," Ed murmured beside him, all his earlier gallows humor drained away. "There's so many." "There's exactly as many as there are," Geralt said, quiet and level. Because panic helped no one, and he'd learned across 2 decades that calm, even manufactured calm, was often the only weapon available against odds too large to properly comprehend. Fight what's in front of you. Trust the fire. Trust the dragon glass. Don't let their numbers make you forget what actually kills them. The battle, when it came, arrived in a crashing wave of violence that made the earlier skirmish beyond the wall look like a training exercise. Whites broke against the wall's defenders in wave after wave, burning blades and dragon glass-tipped spears cutting them down by the dozen. And still they came, an endless tide that made even Geralt's disciplined focus falter with the sheer, grinding arithmetic of it. It was the White Walkers who changed the fight's true shape. One broke from the vanguard and scaled the wall's ice with impossible, gravity-defying grace, and Geralt met it at the parapet with silver blade already drawn, an instinct that saved his life, because the moment their blades crossed, ice-forged steel met silver in a shriek of impossible cold that traveled up his arm like fire in reverse, numbing muscle and bone in a way no wound on the continent had ever managed. The White Walker's expression, if the alien, ancient thing wearing something like a face could be said to express anything at all, carried a flicker of something Geralt read, with the professional clarity of a man who'd spent his life reading monsters, as genuine surprise. Whatever it had expected from a stranger's blade, silver forged on a different world entirely hadn't been it. Geralt didn't waste the advantage of its hesitation. He drove forward, silver blade catching the ice sword in a bind, twisted with technique honed across decades of duels against things far more skilled than most men gave monsters credit for, and opened a line across the White Walker's chest that shouldn't, by every law Geralt understood about such creatures, have done anything at all. It shattered. Not died, shattered, exploding outward in a spray of ice and cold that took the nearest whites down with it, their animation failing in an instant, collapsing like puppets with every string cut simultaneously. Geralt stood in the sudden silence of that small victory, breathing hard, understanding with the flat clarity of hard-won knowledge exactly what he'd just proven. Silver worked. Not as reliably as dragonglass, not as cleanly as Valyrian steel, but it worked. One more weapon, in a war that had, until tonight, offered defenders precious few. "Silver kills them," he shouted, voice carrying across the chaos of the battlements. "Aim for the White Walkers themselves, not just their dead. Cut the head off this, and the whites that answer to it fall with it." The lesson spread through the defenders with the desperate speed of men finally handed real hope, and the battle's shape shifted. No longer a hopeless grind against endless numbers, but a battle with an actual exploitable weakness, however narrow. John fought beside him with Valyrian steel inherited from his family's ancient blade, cutting down a second White Walker with the same shattering result. Egret's arrows, tipped with dragonglass at Geralt's own insistence weeks earlier, found throats and eyes with brutal precision. But the enemy commander, Geralt understood, with the certainty of a man who'd learned to read a battlefield's true architecture across decades of contracts, that something coordinated this assault with more than simple numbers, hadn't yet fully committed. And when it did, Riding a horrific skeletal steed of ice and old bone through the shattered gate the Whites had finally breached at the wall's weakest point, Geralt understood he was looking at the true source of everything he'd spent weeks investigating. The Night King's eyes found his across the chaos of the breach, and Geralt felt, for the first time in this entire strange war, something that might have honestly been called fear, not the manageable, professional wariness he brought to every contract, but a deeper, colder recognition of something ancient enough that his own considerable experience offered no real comfort. "That's him," John breathed beside him. "That's the one." Geralt didn't answer. He was already moving, silver blade raised, toward the breach, and the thing waiting patiently within it. Because whatever came next, whatever this fight ultimately cost, he understood with total clarity that this was the moment his choice to stay, made weeks ago, in a frozen forest over a corpse that wouldn't stay dead, had always been building toward. The Night King raised a hand, and the temperature at the breach dropped so suddenly that frost formed instantly across Geralt's exposed skin, his breath crystallizing mid-exhale. Around him, the nearest Whites surged forward with renewed, desperate purpose, buying their master time, and Geralt understood he wouldn't reach the true enemy alone, not through this many bodies, not with the wall itself beginning to groan and crack under whatever ancient magic the Night King was now turning directly against it. "John," he shouted, "the breach. We close it or we lose the wall entirely." They fought together toward the widening gap, silver and Valyrian steel cutting a bloody path through Whites that seemed to multiply faster than they could be felled, Ygritte and a dozen free folk warriors covering their flank. Melisandre's fire magic finally, fully unleashed in great arcing gouts of flame that turned entire sections of the assault to ash. It was, Geralt understood even in the chaos of the fighting, the first moment every faction he'd encountered in this strange world, Watch, Wildling, Red Priestess, Witcher, had truly fought as one, however briefly, against a threat too vast for any single philosophy to face alone. The Night King, watching this unified defense, with what Geralt could only read as cold, ancient calculation, raised his arms, and the ice beneath their feet began, with terrible deliberation, to crack. The ice cracked in a spiderweb pattern racing outward from the breach, and Geralt understood, with the flat clarity of a man who'd faced enough impossible odds to recognize the shape of a losing position, that the Night King intended to bring the wall down entirely rather than simply force it. A strategy so patient, so utterly indifferent to the cost of 8,000 years of magic unmade in a single gesture, that it told Geralt everything he needed to know about what they were truly fighting. "He means to collapse the whole wall." Melisandre's voice cut through the chaos, raw with something that sounded, for the first time since Geralt had met her, like genuine terror, rather than prophetic certainty. "If it falls here, the wards fail everywhere. There'll be nothing left to stop them. Not here, not anywhere south of this." Geralt didn't waste breath answering. He was already moving, cutting through the press of Whites, toward the widening breach, with a singular, brutal focus, silver blade shedding ice-cold blood with every strike. John fought at his shoulder, Valyrian steel flashing, the ancestral blade humming with a resonance Geralt could feel even through the chaos. Something in that steel recognized the enemy, in a way his own silver, for all its usefulness, didn't quite match. They reached the breach together as the first support strut gave way with a groan, like the world's own bones breaking, and found the Night King waiting with the terrible patience of something that had already won 1,000 times before and saw no particular urgency in winning again. "Geralt!" Ygritte's voice, from somewhere behind, raw with warning. "The Whites, there's too many. We can't hold." "Then don't hold," Geralt shouted back, without turning, every ounce of his attention fixed on the ancient thing before him. "Fall back to the second line. Burn everything behind you. Don't let them regroup." The Night King moved then, Iceblade rising in an arc that Geralt barely read in time, silver meeting frozen steel in a shriek that traveled bone deep, and this time there was no shattering victory, no surprised hesitation, only raw, ancient power meeting a stranger's blade in a contest Geralt understood. Within 3 exchanged strikes, he could not win through skill alone. This wasn't a lesser White Walker startled by unfamiliar silver. This was the source itself, and it fought with the calm, devastating economy of something that had never once needed to fear a mortal blade. Jon pressed in from the flank, Valyrian steel finding an opening Geralt's exchange had bought, and for one instant, the Night King's attention split between two threats, the precise weakness Geralt had been buying time to create. He drove forward with everything 2 decades of contract-honed instinct could offer, silver blades seeking the same killing angle that had shattered a lesser walker at the wall's parapet. It wasn't enough alone. The Night King's ice blade caught his silver in a bind that should have shattered ordinary steel, held with a strength that made Geralt's mutated musculature scream with effort. And in that suspended, brutal stalemate, Geralt understood with sudden, complete clarity what this fight actually required. Not one blade, silver or Valyrian, but both, together, in the same instant, striking a wound too fast for even ancient power to fully counter. Now, Jon. Together. Jon didn't hesitate. Valyrian steel and continental silver drove home in the same heartbeat, from opposite angles, and the Night King's ancient composure finally, genuinely cracked, not shattering as the lesser walker had, but staggering, ice flesh splitting along both wounds simultaneously, a sound escaping it that was less scream than the groan of glacier ice giving way after 10,000 years of patient pressure. It didn't die outright, but it broke, staggered back through the collapsing breach with a violence that suggested genuine, ancient pain. And in that staggering retreat, every wight within sight of the battle collapsed in an instant, animation failing en masse, as whatever will had sustained them lost its grip. The tide that had seemed unstoppable moments before simply, suddenly, stopped. The wall itself groaned, cracked, held, barely, the breach still wide and vulnerable, but no longer actively widening, the Night King's assault broken, rather than triumphant. Silence fell across the battlements in the aftermath, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the ragged breathing of defenders who understood, with the particular clarity of people who'd survived something they genuinely expected to die in, that they'd bought themselves time rather than victory. Melisandre found Geralt afterward, standing at the shattered breach's edge, silver blade still in hand, watching the northern horizon where the Night King's broken forces had withdrawn into the dark. "He'll return," she said quietly. "Wounded, but not destroyed. The flames have shown me enough to know this war isn't ended tonight." "I never expected it to be," Geralt said. "Wounds like that don't kill something that survived 8,000 years. They just teach it to be more careful next time." He sheathed his blade, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the fight settle into muscle and bone, with familiar, honest weight. But it retreated. That's more than anyone here expected a week ago. Jon approached, blood-streaked but alive, Egret and a battered contingent of free folk warriors trailing behind him. Watch and wildlings standing shoulder to shoulder in the breach's aftermath, an alliance forged in desperation that Geralt suspected, with weary realism, wouldn't survive the return of easier, more comfortable enmities once the immediate crisis passed. "You could have died there," Jon said. "Both of us could have." "Could have," Geralt agreed. "Didn't. That's the only arithmetic that matters, in the end." He looked out at the breach, at the wall's wound still gaping despite its held integrity, and felt the particular weight of a choice he'd made weeks ago in a frozen forest, over a corpse that wouldn't stay dead. The choice to stay, to fight, to trade the comfortable fiction of neutrality for something heavier and far more dangerous. This isn't finished, not close to it, but it's not lost tonight either. For a war like this, I've learned that's sometimes the only victory worth counting. Mormont arrived as dawn broke gray and merciless over the battlefield, surveying the breach with the grim satisfaction of a commander who'd expected to lose far more than he had. His gaze found Geralt across the wreckage, and something passed between them that needed no words. The specific respect of men who'd gambled everything on an impossible night and found, against every reasonable expectation, that they'd survive to gamble again. "The wall held," Mormont said simply. "Barely. But it held, and I don't believe it would have, without the silver blade that fought beside Valyrian steel tonight." He extended a hand, formal in a way that carried genuine weight from a man who rarely offered such gestures. "The Night's Watch owes you a debt I don't know how we'll ever properly repay, Witcher." "Don't repay it," Geralt said, clasping the offered hand. Just don't waste what we bought tonight arguing over whose banner deserves credit for it. That thing's coming back. When it does, you'll need every ally you can hold on to. Watch, wildling, and whatever else this world can throw at the problem. In the days that followed, word of the battle spread south with the particular speed of news too vast to contain. A stranger who fought beside Valyrian steel and broke the Night King's assault, a silver blade from nowhere the maesters could name, a wall that held against impossible odds. Ravens carried the story toward King's Landing, toward Dragonstone, toward every corner of a continent that had spent generations treating the true war as children's superstition. Some would believe. Most, Geralt suspected with weary realism, would find ways to dismiss it, folding it into the endless, exhausting game of politics that had never truly stopped, even as the world's actual ending pressed closer at the gates. He stood atop the repaired section of the wall some weeks later, watching the northern horizon where something ancient and patient continued gathering strength for a war far from finished, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who'd built and rebuilt his entire philosophy more than once, that he'd become something in this world he'd sworn, weeks ago, he wouldn't allow himself to become again. Invested. Committed, a man with a stake in an outcome larger than any contract's clean edges could ever contain. He found, standing there in the killing cold, with Ygritte at his side and Jon's steady presence somewhere nearby, that he didn't entirely mind what he'd become. The long night was far from over. The wall had held, but the wound in it remained, a scar that would need generations to fully mend, even as the true war continued gathering in the dark beyond it. Geralt of Rivia, witcher, outsider, a man who'd spent his life refusing destiny's pull, only to find himself standing at the center of a war he'd never chosen, understood he had no way home, no portal waiting to return him to a continent that felt, now, impossibly distant. What remained was simpler and harder, a war without end in sight, allies whose trust he'd earned through blood rather than birthright, and a growing, uncomfortable conviction that this fight, however far from his own world's shores, had become genuinely his to finish. Somewhere south, in halls of gold and ambition, lords still played their games, unaware how close the true ending had come to arriving at their gates unannounced. Somewhere north, wounded but patient, the Night King gathered his forces once more. And somewhere at the wall's shattered edge, a witcher who'd never believed in destiny sharpened his silver blade and waited for whatever came next. All men must die, but legends endure. More stories await.